Hi, everyone. My name is Paige Lilligard, and I'm a senior on the Accelerated Bachelor's to Master's program from Public Health Policy and Management, as well as a Loyola Stans Fellow. I'm honored to now welcome Eddie Bocanegra, a nationally recognized leader in community violence intervention and criminal justice reform. As the former senior advisor for community violence intervention in the U.S. Department of Justice, he brings a rare federal to local perspective to his work. His leadership across Chicago's public safety landscape and national CVI initiative positions him uniquely to unpack how government actions shape community outcomes. And today, he'll guide us through the evolving federal role in violence prevention and what it means for the future of safety and justice. Let's welcome on Eddie.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
See some good friends, Maria, David Olson, Christina, a good friend, Matt, and Mateo. I'm excited about hearing the rest of the comments today, but I also I'm reflecting on something that Arnie mentioned, right, about our current government at the federal level. It's really important that I mention former senior advisor. It's unfortunate that just a few months back I had to resign simply because our values and the way that we think about public safety just wasn't really aligning. And I'm hoping that I could share a little bit of a little bit of what did take place in the 3.5 years that I was there, and where our current situation is at right now, and what does it mean for the sustainability of this kind of work moving forward. It's interesting that we're in this position here at Loyola, which is I'm 15 minutes away going west. And I think about some of the current work that I'm doing right now with Noah's Ark Foundation as an interim executive director. And I highlight this word, ark, in Noah's Ark, the bridge. Hearing from Arnie earlier and the young men that you heard their testimonies and their experience, those words, in many ways, are the arc to making to build that proximity, as Brian Stevenson points out. If you drive about 15, 20 minutes west of us, you're in Oak Brook. And if none of you have ever drove through Oak Brook, it's an amazing, amazing town. You could tell people there are very well off. If you drive 15, 20 minutes east, just take Roosevelt to Cermak. It's an entire different world. It's the same communities that some of the folks in this room have been operating, have been instrumental in creating public safety, not just through law enforcement, but through supporting people and meeting them where they're at. And I think about this institution, Loyola, given its mission as being part of also the ARC, the bridge. And so I'm very grateful to Lucia and the staff here for the opportunity to allow me to be here and just share a few reflections. You know, it's good to be in community with people who understand both the promise and the pressure of this moment for community violence intervention. Over the last several years, we witnessed something unprecedented. The federal government made historic, coordinated investments in community-based safety strategies. Through the Community Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative, DOJ created a dedicated funding stream that supported local government, community-based organization, statewide offices of gun violence, intermediary, and technical assistance providers, not to mention research. For the first time, the federal government wasn't just funding programs, it was helping to build the infrastructure of the field. But we also have to be honest about where we are today. The political climate has shifted. Funding levels have changed, and many of the communities that stepped up to build the CVI capacity, often for the first time, are now facing uncertainty about how to sustain that work. These challenges are real, and they affect the people doing this work on the ground every day, as well as the people impacted directly by gun violence. Even so, the need for community-driven safety strategies has not gone away. The data still shows that CBI saves lives. And in fact, before coming to DOJ, I led one of the largest anti-violence programs in our country called Ready Chicago, Rapid Employment Development Initiative, which is one of two, to the best of my knowledge, RCT evaluated programs that really focus on high-risk individuals. So same population that Chicago Credit just highlighted, but you're adding now a formal randomized controlled trial study. I have a lot of thoughts and opinions around that. Happy to discuss this with David Olson later on. But nevertheless, at the highest level of research, right, we were able to demonstrate that with the right investments, the right people, and the right program and services, you are able to actually change people's lives and trajectories. There are several things that I want to highlight in the minutes that I have here, and ideally take 5-10 minutes, which is some general questions. I want to highlight the importance of advocacy. You see, prior to DOJ, prior to our previous administration putting funding into CBI, that didn't exist. And it wasn't until a small group of people from across the country that were at the forefront of CBI efforts were really pushing and advocating both at the local level and the national level to make this a priority for the administration when Biden came in. And many of you have heard perhaps of organizations called like Giffers in Every Town and Mom to Man Action. I see the red shirts back there. Incredible, incredible organizations. And I would say that that is one form of advocacy. But often in communities, that the ones you just shared, that you heard from folks from Chicago Cred, and some that you'll hear from Matt and Mateo today, those communities, their advocacy often goes silent. For the first time, in combination and in partnership with like the agencies I just mentioned a second ago, you were able to galvanize the field to really draw the attention of gun violence not only impacting schools or suburban communities, but communities like North Lawndale, South Lawndale, Inglewood, Austin, Garfield. And as a result of that advocacy and through a lot of pressure, healthy pressure, the administration, through a bipartisan support, passed a law that allowed for the government to put real dollars behind CBI. Now, I highlight that for two reasons. One, the advocacy that came behind that work, very, very critical. And we're in a time today that that advocacy, that coordinating efforts combined collectively with the folks in this room and others, is a way for us in the next 3 years to think about like what does that work, what does that power base look like for us? The second reason why I point that out is that now there's a precedence. You see, even despite of the changes of administration, while half of the funding in CBI was cut off, there still are some resources that are going to CBI with a heavy focus on law enforcement. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, I would say in the last 3.5 years, we saw law enforcement really recognize that public safety doesn't just fall on them, that you do need community. And from the dozen or so large law enforcement agencies that before I was at DOJ, there's probably about 4 to 5 dozen now across the country that recognize CBI as part of their strategy to reducing gun violence. So think about that. Think about the shift in the way that law enforcement has been thinking about their job and partnerships. I also will admit that it's not always been easy, and I'll give you an example of that. About 5-6 months after I was in, I remember receiving a call from one of our colleagues, and the call was that there was an outreach worker that was indicted. I won't mention the exact police department or the exact town, but it was somewhere in California, and it won't take too much for you to look them up a bit. And so this police department reached out to us and said, "Hey, we like to discontinue our partnership with this particular nonprofit." And they gave the rationale and the reason why that the young man was indicted for possession of a gun. And and our colleagues were actually encouraging that we should maybe stop the funding for this organization. But after further looking into it, just 2 years prior, that police department faced some indictments themselves, in which the police chief and other officers were also indicted. So a couple of days later, I asked my colleague, "Hey, I'm just very curious. Did we stop funding that police department after this happened?" The answer was no. There will be mistakes that happen in any professional field, particularly in a field that is still in its infancy, even though this work has existed back in the 50s and 40s when there was a researcher out of U Chicago named Thrasher. I want to give a selfish plug to U Chicago. But there is a lot of research that we have been able to harness here in our city around gangs. And that work has actually evolved. At the federal government, that thinking that all services or all intervention should only go to gang involved violence is farther from the truth. We recognized at the time that I was there that if we were aiming to support this kind of work, that we really had to focus on intermediaries to build the capacity of smaller nonprofit organizations, that we had to build technical support for many of the organizations that are what I would consider kind of a mom and pops organization. It is really truly about building our capacity. And that was perhaps one of 5 biggest lessons learned around that, which is the need to really invest in the back office support for organizations, so that the same young people that you saw today, 5 years from now, are running the same organizations. The other thing that I want to highlight in terms of a lesson learned is that narrative really matters in this work. The people who control the narrative really dictate in many instances like what becomes of this work. And for so long, the narrative around this work was that we're not going to see a return of investment. It's hiring people from the community that have been impacted, either survivors of gun violence or gangs themselves. And now we're asking to do this. Like there is no really return of investment behind that. And that what makes a difference is one of the prime examples. After serving 14 years in a state prison, I became in multiple organizations as executive director and being at the highest level of government. So even when I hear those 2 gentlemen today speaking, I tell myself like, wow, they are going to be prime for what leadership looks like in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
I highlight that because it goes back to just the fundamentals, like in any business. We need to invest in the people who are doing this work. We need to build and support organizations that are doing this work so they could deliver not just quantity, but quality. It's no difference if one of us was to be shot, and I'm not going to mention other hospitals around here, right? But Loyola Hospital is a Trauma One hospital. I would assume this is where you want to go. So in the same essence, that organizations that are doing the service, we want to make sure that we're equipping them with the right tools. And at DOJ, we were doing that. And that unfortunately is not happening anymore. But that's not to say that at the local level, that we cannot take what we learn and apply it here in the state of Illinois. And in fact, I was just on a call yesterday with Doris, who is the head person of ICEJA, one of the funding arms of the state of Illinois. And I just saw it all and admiration for the way that she has been going about the work and investments in public safety, but also the amount of money that has gone to support this work. And I still would argue that we need more. Lastly, I want to point out that while there are many lessons that I'm happy to share today into this conversation about those lessons that I learned at DOJ and how they apply here in our own state, in our own backyard, in the city of Chicago and Maywood and in Cook County, I want to summarize it by just identifying 4 things Strengthening the CBI workforce is going to be critical for us. Building durable state and local funding streams. There is no other state in the United States that has demonstrated very intentional collaboration across various aspects of government at the local level. The level of investments that have taken place, already mentioned about the business community stepping in. And there are some of the best research and largest investments in the country are happening here. And I want to point that out because we're not going to always see that return of investment in everything tomorrow. We have to play the long game. Just like we would do in any study of medicine, or as we think about patients, that we have to really continue to build a capacity. And the other thing that I say is improving coordinating across federal agencies. I guess there's a part of me that's still hopeful that people will make the right decisions, that some of those resources go into our communities. But if that's not the case, then what can we do to start having those conversations with our elected officials in DC to ensure that next year or the next 3 years, we actually have a strategy to really help sustain this work? And lastly, and related to that, is continuing to protect CBI resources from political shifts. There are people who will approach this kind of work from a very punitive perspective, meaning lock them up, throw away the key. That people are beyond redeemable. And I can't help but to wonder, right? Like, I am raising 9 kids, 9 children. And I'm wondering what kind of community and what kind of world do I want to raise my kids? And it is my hope as a Christian that they see Christ in every person they come across, meaning they see the goodness in all people, even when they made mistakes. And that progress is not linear, that people will fall. As a well-accomplished person, I will tell you that I still struggle. Trauma is real. I still get emotional, even from watching movies at times, cartoon movies at that. And I think that if we want people to continue to be vulnerable, like those 2 gentlemen that were vulnerable today, I would say that there is no better way to honor that level of vulnerability, if not by taking actions, right, to making our communities much safer, much better. So with that, I'll end, but I want to take a few minutes, and I'm going to look at Lucia for whatever time we might have left, or any questions that you might have related to bridging this kind of work on the federal level to the local level.
Actually, a question for you. In your experience as a government official, do you have any advice for other government officials to maintain their humanity in this work? And I think that the level of inhumanity that we're seeing at the federal level is unprecedented. But even at the local level, as somebody who works in a high school, I see even from a school administration and policy standpoint that administration can become very jaded and look at youth in a monolithic way, and make a lot of assumptions about, as you stated, their goodness or their ability to reform. And so I guess 2 questions is, do you have advice for other government officials to maintain that humanity, that hope, and that curiosity when addressing this work? And then 2, is there something in the local level that has been really inspiring you lately and giving you hope amidst the darkness of the times that we're living in?
Yeah, that's a great question and a lot to reflect there. I guess my short answer is this: when I think about just and I mean this in a positive way, the level of harassment that I got from Lucia. Lucia, you want to raise your hand real quick? About I actually had to coordinate my travel tomorrow for DC. I was supposed to head out today, but I didn't because Lucia was on me about making sure that I'm here. And when I see leaders like her, when I see like the great work that Matt Mateo has been doing in Little Village, right, and across the city for that matter, when I see other folks, when I see David Olson and his work around criminal justice, when I look at Maria and her testimony about, how personal it is for her, and when I see the red shirts with Moms Demand Action, like that gives me hope. That genuinely gives me hope. Because despite of our politics, right, despite how the fact that now in today's day we have social media that really expedites, and we are human beings and we're very curious, and I'm guilty of this. Sometimes when I see posts on Facebook, whether it's someone being shot or somebody making a negative comment, like I tend to just go there first because I'm curious about their perspective on this. And you know what I do, and I'm guilty, and I'm trying not to do this. I go to people's feed, like Facebook feed, and I see all the negativity, all the wrong comments. Like I'll bet you, if this was put on YouTube or some like what's the other social media? Snapchat, Instagram, right? All that, right? Sorry, I'm aging myself now. And the two gentlemen, right, that you heard earlier, I will bet you that there'll be a lot of people that would say something more negative than positive. And so I also ask us in this space, how do we also create a bridge? Like, why don't we say something positive, right? Here in the space, but also when you're in social media and challenge people, and sometimes even your own family. And trust me, I have my own family who have very conservative views about things. They're all also misinformed. So sometimes educating people, right, and to do it in a respectful way, because it's almost like evangelizing people. Nobody wants to be evangelized, right? And so I think it's also the way and the way you frame your work. But I want to go back to Brian Stevenson. And if you don't know who he is, I encourage you to Google him. He's done some great work. Father Great Bull is another person who I think about are two amazing examples of seeing the humanity in people. Brian Stevenson talks about building proximity. I think in today's society, and particularly in our country, we're forgetting how to be empathetic. We're forgetting how to really put ourselves in other people's shoes. And I would like to believe, and I think this is true, that it's really just a small group of people that really have a hard time doing it. The majority of us, the majority of people actually are more empathetic. And for whatever reason, right, it's the small group of people who are not that I really, their message, right, is at the front center of a lot of, our day-to-day lives. And so I just encourage, right, for us in this room, like, how do we build that proximity? How can we be a bridge? Going back to Noah's Ark Foundation. How can we be an ark? How can we be the ark? So your question is more complicated. I wish I had more time, right? But those are my 2 cents there.
Hi, Eddie, Stephanie Kimmel.
Good seeing you again.
Great to see you. Yeah, great following your career all these years. I'm curious to hear, at the federal level, did you come across other folks with the lived experience? I mean, similar or coming from any backgrounds like yours, or were you an anomaly at the federal level in this type of work?
Yeah. So let me share a quick story. Before Biden won the election, when he was running, there was a group of people in the space of gun violence that were kind of coming together to convene and talk about the recommendations they wanted to give Biden. And initially, I was asked to join that group. And then about 3 weeks later, they asked me that I had to be removed because of my background. And their response or their comments to me was, hey, it's going to be a very close race. We can't afford to have any blind sides. So Eddie, we're going to ask you to step out, you'll step away. Now I negotiated. I was bigger than that, but I said, okay. I was hurt. I was really hurt by that. But I was able to put somebody in my team in my replacement just to make sure that we're bringing the best research into the space. And then Biden won the election. That group was taken down, and then in in mid-November, another set of group of people, Amber Goodwin being one of them, actually made some recommendations in terms of who could be in a small group to give the president now-elect advice. And so I was actually one of those individuals, a very small group of us. It was my way of saying, kind of sticking it back to them. It's like, okay, you didn't want me in the other group, it's fine. I'm in this group now. I'm really now really advising. And it was tremendous to be in that space because I often will look around and like I didn't see people like myself, people who look like me or came from the same communities that I came from, or that lived experience. By that I mean the justice impacted experience. And then after Biden was in office, about 6 months in, I started getting some calls from the White House, and they're asking all these great questions. And at the same time, this wonderful person, Amy Sellerman, who ended up becoming the Assistant Attorney General at DOJ, was also giving me these calls. And next thing you know, a year passed. By that time, I flew to DC about 3 times, met with the president, met with the Attorney General. It was incredible. It was an incredible experience to be in that room. And I also realized after about the third time, it didn't feel special anymore, right? It actually felt more like they're just like me. They're just regular people. They're just regular people. I get a call from the Department of Justice and they say, hey, they want to do a site visit. They came out 24 hours before that day. We had 10 shootings, 2 mass shootings happened back to back in North London. I thought they were going to cancel. The Attorney General still showed up. Lots of security, lots of detail. He still showed up. And what stood out for him was the fact that we had good research and he heard directly from the people that were impacted by this issue. Right after that, pretty much he co-signed for me to go to DOJ. And I served as an appointee at the Department of Justice. And I would say, while we've had fellows who have been formerly incarcerated, this is the first time that DOJ at this level of government is like, I wasn't just a senior advisor to like an office in DOJ, right? I was a senior advisor to the Office of Justice Programs, which is the largest funding arm of the Department of Justice, $4 to $5 billion a year. So that's where I was situated, and my boss was Amy Sellerman. I share that because that created a precedent for the next person. And in fact, shortly after that, the leadership there, including the Attorney General and others, a lot of the career folks, were able to change our internal policies to hire people with backgrounds. So almost 3 years later, I became a career Fed. I don't know another career Fed who was locked up for environmental offenses as I was. And now there's a president there, Kim. And so even today with this current government, DOJ cannot necessarily discriminate because of your background. And if I look at my life, Kim, I would say that I've spent all my career in trying to disrupt those policies and create pathways for others. And that's why, again, I want to go back to these 2 gentlemen that we heard earlier. I see myself in a space, like, how am I creating spaces for them, right? And so that they too one day could surpass where I'm at as well. And I'm grateful, but that also comes from like you all also encouraging elected officials to have the courage and the guts, right, to make those tough decisions in their offices, because they could do the same thing too. So anyway.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to be getting started. We hope that everyone enjoyed hearing Eddie Bocanegra speak on the federal role in community violence intervention. I would like to take this moment to briefly introduce myself. Hello, my name is Claudia Aro. I am a senior studying public health here at Loyola University, and I'm on the Accelerated Masters in Public Health program. I have the privilege to be one of this year's Loyola Stands Against Gun Violence Fellows as well. I am honored here today to introduce our next speakers for this next session, titled An Interdisciplinary Response for Community Justice, featuring Loyola's Holistic Immigration Hub. Loyola's Immigration Hub at Loyola University Chicago is an interdisciplinary initiative that brings together experts across law, public health, medicine, education, and social work to address the complex challenges facing migrant communities. Rooted in Loyola's commitment to justice, the Hub's focuses on leadership, service, and innovation in training for the next generation of professionals while supporting local communities. Today's speakers reflect this interdisciplinary collaboration and will share how community violence is impacting their work. For this session, we will also have time for audience questions. At the end, we invite you to come either to either of the two microphones or type in the online chat to ask your questions for our speakers. Please join me in welcoming Loyola leadership featuring Loyola's Holistic Immigration Hub. Dr. Amy Blair, Dr. Amy Nelson Christensen, Dr. Maria Vidal Jaimes, Dr. Ruth Gomberg, and Professor Sarah Diaz, who will begin the session.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So my name is Sarah Diaz. I'm clinical faculty at Loyola School of Law and co-director of Loyola's new Holistic Immigration Hub. We were asked to join today's symposium to talk a little bit about what Loyola is doing in the face of what feels like increasing levels of state violence against our communities in the context of immigration, especially, of course, in the aftermath of Midway Blitz. Take a second. So as we all witnessed in the recent immigration enforcement measures in Chicago and around other parts of the country, we experienced direct violence in our communities, right? And an increased community vulnerability to violence in the aftermath of Operation Midway Blitz. So at Loyola, we're fortunate enough to be in the middle of launching a 4-year interdisciplinary effort to curate educational programming that supports students and communities as we face this growing violence. Each of my colleagues is going to talk a little bit about what they're seeing in their fields. But before we get started, I wanted to just give a little context to the hub. I don't know if it's going to fit in. We're having a time. Okay.
Teamwork.
Thank you. Closer? Okay. I'm usually too loud, so this is new for me. Okay, that one's still not working. There it goes. Okay. So as a Jesuit university, Loyola is committed to the Ignatian heritage of cura personalis, right? We're all familiar with the idea of caring for the whole person. We're called to center the dignity of those who come before us, whether students, patients, clients, to ensure that we're meeting their holistic needs. As my colleague and co-director Catherine Waltz likes to remind us, the secular version of this can be found in the human rights paradigm. In the human rights world, we're called to recognize the inherent dignity and the equal rights of all members of our human family. And so that, I think, is what we seek to do at Loyola across the hub. We seek to recognize the fundamental dignity of the members of the migrant community that come before us in whatever way they come before us. At the law school, before the hub was created, many members of the migrant community actually came before us as students. Loyola has a rich history of serving migrant students, I believe, especially on this campus. I often refer to some of these students as system involved. Many of these students have really experienced the immigration system in destructive ways, right? They've watched their parents deported from the United States. Others view the world through the lens of being documented. These students face the possibility, especially in this moment, of apprehension, detention, deportation, all while they're seeking their degrees here at Loyola. These students have showed up in our classrooms, and it is clear that they have demanded to do more than learn how to practice law in a broken system. They've repeatedly called on us to create more nuanced spaces for addressing immigration matters, because in their eyes, the immigration system isn't merely broken, it is violent, it is destructive, and they are the ones experiencing the harm. So every facet of the hub has really been designed to respond to this call from students to create a space that fosters change in a way that promotes the health and well-being of all the members of our community. So the goals of the Immigration Hub are threefold. The overarching goal of the hub is to train the next generation of professionals whether they're going to be lawyers, physicians, social workers, educators, to meet this moment head on. Through our programming, our goal is to graduate practice-ready students that are going to go out into the world already thinking about interdisciplinary solutions to their work. The second goal of the hub is to ensure we are acting in service of Loyola's community partners who are doing this work in the field. As we all know, some are here today. There are incredible organizations in Chicago who are already serving migrants. We want to make sure we're leveraging the resources of academia to help meet the needs in the field. And lastly, of course, we seek to catalyze the visionary systemic change that our students demand. Through a pan-university interdisciplinary approach to problem solving, we aim to retrain our students and sometimes even ourselves to think outside the box and to think about how to engage in normative shifts in the way people think about migration policy, shifts in beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes around immigration, around migrants, and of course, to center the dignity of the people at the center of this discourse. So it looks like we might be missing a slide, but we do that in 3 ways. We do that through the Immigration Clinic, the Immigration Law Lab, and the Innovation Incubator. And I'm going to just speak really briefly about each of those. They're situated in the law school, but they engage across disciplines. The Immigration and Human Rights Clinic is designed to train students both in immigrant legal service delivery and immigration human rights models. So students, yes, they're going to learn how to practice law in a broken system, but we have to do that to reduce harm, right? At the same time, they're going to figure out how to impact change by leveraging human rights systems. So for example, students in our clinic at this moment are documenting human rights abuses that took place under Operation Midway Blitz to elevate down the line. To ensure that our work is holistic in our client-facing actions, we often bring students and faculty from across schools to receive cross-disciplinary training. So for example, students in the clinic are working alongside social work faculty and students to develop mental health evaluations for clients. And going forward, we're hoping to start working with strict physicians and students to develop medical forensic evaluations for client survivors of persecution and torture. The second module is the Immigration Law Lab, and it's designed to centralize and basically curate student volunteering so that we can centralize, train students, and then send them off into the world to volunteer in positions where we see the need in the community. This semester's lab, we have students from multiple schools across Loyola, and they're partnering with groups like the National Immigrant Justice Center, the Resurrection Project. They're in workshops, filing asylum applications, filing naturalization applications. Students are in courtrooms, acting as legal observers. Students are in the classroom learning from each other, how best to meet the needs of the community from a multidisciplinary perspective. And lastly, in order to catalyze the visionary systemic change that our students desire and that we all hope to curate, we've developed the Innovation Incubator. And essentially that is designed to take in complex thematic issues from across the community, issues like ones we'll talk about today, to move them and elevate them across multidisciplinary review, to think more creatively about really nuanced solutions to complex migration issues. And in this effort, we want to be able to bridge the gap between academia, so those of us in the room, and practice, right? We want to be able to really bring tangible outcome documents to the people in the field doing the work. So the hub itself is situated in the law school, but we have the pleasure of working alongside the incredible faculty with us here today, all of whom are experts in the intersection of migration in their respective fields. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Amy Blair to talk about what's happening at Stritch.
So I want to start by just saying how wonderful it is to be with the Loyola Stands here. I've been at this conference, I don't know if it was every one of the last 7 years. And, situated here on the medical campus, we've had speakers before speak on from the trauma service, from the prevention through promoting safe gun storage within primary care offices, from all sorts of perspectives. And I want to tell you where I'm sort of rooted. I'm rooted in all those places, but also in public health, because I also have an affiliate appointment in public health, and I'm a primary care physician. So this upstream health sort of model, which is that, the minute that we have someone arriving in a hospital or on a trauma service, that's pretty downstream from where the problems begin. And I think this whole morning, that's been the discussion, that if we want to address structural violence, we have to do it in a multidisciplinary way and think about how our communities have access to food, have access to education. So here at Stritch, in terms of the role we play with the Holistic Immigration Hub, and it's rooted in that same sort of thought about the upstream factors of health for all people that come into our clinic, no matter what their immigration status is or what community they live in. So I would say first, that's what we're doing at Stritch, is continuing to educate our students to promote health and to prevent injury and illness. We have to think outside of the emergency room, outside of the exam room. The second thing, and Sarah alluded to this, was that we're involved in, is thinking about the intersection of our role as physicians in promoting human rights, in advocating alongside attorneys. It's no secret that normally doctors don't like to work with attorneys. And so promoting a model where attorneys and physicians work together to change laws and policies, but also to advocate for people who are involved in the legal process in one way or the other. I was thinking about this, and I just have to quickly share that our own Dr. Martin Tobin, who works at Hines, was the medical expert who testified in the George Floyd case when he had to basically speak about how asphyxiation does indeed kill a man, right? And that role that a physician can play in a case from an immigrant or someone seeking asylum, a refugee, saying that the scars or the evidence on their body or in their mental and psychological health do show that they were persecuted and that they fear future persecution. So in the intersection of, again, health and human rights, I do those exams. I used to do them just completely without anyone knowing. And now I do that as part of the McNeil Asylum Clinic, where we take cases where attorneys have identified that a physical exam could be helpful for that person's asylum process. So we hope to train more physicians and students to do that. And finally, a lot of the work, and as Sarah alluded to, has changed in the last year. So when our federal government took away the safe spaces designation for hospitals, schools, and religious places, that meant that immigration enforcement could occur in hospitals. So people in the custody of immigration officials, ICE and CBP, were brought into our hospital. Now, that's not the first time that people in custody have been in hospitals, right? We care for everyone. We would care for the enforcement official if they got ill. But in the this last fall of 2025, being in close proximity to the Broadway detention facility, our hospital saw a huge number of people brought in custody, in the emergency room, in the trauma bay, labor and delivery, pediatrics, ICU, you name it. There were people who were federal immigration officials with our patients. So some of the work that we've done and writing that I've done alongside people from my colleague here, Dr. Nguyen, from the emergency room, and people in the law school, was to begin to talk about how everyone has the right to health. We are not here to understand the case or the crime. We're certainly not here to understand immigration laws. We're here to take care of the patient in front of us. And luckily, there is now a state law where hospitals have to institute policies to make sure that all people are receiving the standard of care, including private exams and access to food and water when they need it. So that has been a majority of what our focus has been in the last 6 months as the issue of immigration continues to evolve. So that's my perspective from Stritch. I'll pass it to the next Amy.
Okay, so I would not call myself an expert on immigration, but I would consider myself an expert on trauma-sensitive schools and also affirming school environments or learning environments. And so in the School of Education, the School of Law, when we were kind of conceptualizing the hub, reached out to say, looking for opportunities to collaborate. And one of the things that we do in the School of Ed is we really value our community partnerships. We honestly can't train our students to be change agents and social justice warriors in the field of education without our community partnerships. And so we've had a longstanding partnership with Chicago Public Schools and thinking about ways, how do we train the next generation of educators so they can make schools continually better for the children that they serve. And so in our partnership with Chicago Public Schools, during I think it was about a few years ago, when children, migrant families, children included, were being dropped off in major metropolitan areas, Chicago was one of those cities that received a large group of people from the border. And CPS had to scramble to get children registered, going to shelters and get them registered. And one of the things we learned from that experience was, and we refer to children and families who are new to the United States in education, newcomers, migrant children and families who are new to the United States within the last 3 to 5 years, depending on whether or not you look at Illinois definition or national definition, but they're new to the United States within the last 3 to 5 years. And they were navigating different systems that were different, that were all unique in and of themselves. And so as social workers are going out to shelters to get students enrolled in Chicago Public Schools, they were also connecting them with other systems and other hoops that they had to jump through to get access to medical services, to get access to mental health treatment because they experienced significant trauma as they were crossing the border. And so a lot of hoops and a lot of things that families were navigating as they were trying to settle here in Chicago. In addition to that, in 2018, in the Loyola 2020 strategic plan, School of Education was also partnered with the university to operate community schools. And this, for those of you who aren't familiar with the community schools model, I have the 4 pillars up here on the screen. This is something that the School of Education values very deeply. And how do we structure schools that also aligns to our transformative education mission in the School of Education, but also at Loyola? How do we create school environments that really serve our communities? And so the community schools model was something that was actually developed in Chicago. As a former professional practitioner in school psychology in Milwaukee Public Schools, we would actually study Chicago and how they implemented their community schools. And so I feel very lucky to now come to the birthplace of community schools. But in that, there are 4 pillars. The first being that our supports are integrated throughout the school. We also offer enrichment opportunities that expand upon the classroom environment. We provide we strategically use the term family engagement because it's the idea that parents and families can serve as leaders in their school communities as well. And so you think in Chicago Public Schools, we have the local school councils, which were also started here in Chicago, but then also thinking about collaborative leadership and practices, again, partnering with families to make decisions, empowering families to have a voice in their school community. To create a community school is also actually not that expensive. All you have to do is hire a community schools coordinator or resource coordinator, depending on what model you hear those terms interchangeably, but they essentially do a needs assessment for the school and they identify resources based on the needs assessment. And so that's what we do in partnership with Chicago Public Schools is we take on a certain number of schools that want to operate as community schools. Not all schools in Chicago Public Schools are community schools. And we mainly work with schools in the Rogers Park neighborhood, which are in and of themselves a very diverse, rich in diversity, and all the things that come with that. And one of the schools that we partner with is Sullivan High School, which some of you may also know as Refugee High. And so when the School of Law reached out, how do we, within the goals of the Holistic Immigration Hub, partner in collaborating with my colleague Mitch Hendrickson, who manages our partnership schools. We identified Sullivan High School as a place that, based on our needs assessment, there was a need to bring in some immigration legal services, know your rights training, for example, for students and families. And then also to take, as consulting with families, taking on cases and representing families in court. And so the community schools model, if you look across the country, LA Unified School District and Oakland Unified School District also have similar frameworks. And so as we look up best practices of what has been happening, how do you create community schools that meet the needs of newcomer families and children, through the community school model has, through our research, we learned was a best practice. In addition to that, kind of going back to the comment I made earlier about how do we create a more centralized location for services and supports, one of those being immigration services, legal immigration services, is by bringing all those services into one place. One of the things I love about this campus is Loyola, I learned through this process, operates a school-based health clinic or health center. In my training as a school psychologist and learning how do we create these affirming learning environments is bringing everything that a family needs into that school community where the school serves as a hub. And so the idea of, bringing in health clinics where families can get their vaccines, get checked for an ear infection, and also get their physicals so they can participate in sports that are all part of the landscape of services that a school offers, is also part of this idea of how do we expand community schools so that they meet the needs of their community, particularly thinking about the needs of newcomers. And so I feel like I've gone a little bit too long, but I'm going to stop there. And so as we think about the ways that we expand community schools based on the needs of our community and working with newcomer families is really creating our schools as those hubs, those epicenters for all the services that families need, so they can get everything that they need in one place and not have to navigate 12 different systems to get their needs met.
All right, is that good? Mm-hmm. Okay. Good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity to be part of this important conversation on community violence. My name is Maria Vidal, and I'm a faculty member in the School of Social Work at Loyola. And in the School of Social Work, about almost 20 years ago, we made a commitment to looking at this intersection between immigration and social work. And we have a migration studies subspecialization within social work, and now a bilingual MSW program as well that has a focus on immigration. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about the work that we're doing now with the Holistic Immigration Hub, but to provide a little bit of context first. When we talk about violence, we often first think of physical harm. But for immigrant communities in the United States today, violence is operating on multiple interconnected forms, directly, structurally, and culturally. We have all witnessed the violence associated with recent immigration enforcement actions, such as Midway Blitz in Chicago and Metro Surge in Minneapolis. Our minds are imprinted with images of families waking to immigration raids in apartment buildings, masked federal agents arriving in unmarked vehicles to residential neighborhoods, and school and daycare drop-off lines becoming sites of immigration enforcement. We have seen enforcement actions take place in hospitals and in houses of worship, places that should represent safety, care, and community, turned into sites of family separation and terror. Formerly protected sites, as my colleagues were talking about. This direct violence, the immediate physical and psychological harm caused when enforcement operations disrupt daily life, detain loved ones, and expose children and families to fear in highly public ways. The acts of violence directly experienced by immigrants and allies caught up in the aggressive operations conducted by the federal agent surges have caused unthinkable and lasting harm. What concerns me equally is the structural violence that makes these events possible and normalizes their impact. Detention, deportation, prolonged uncertainty, restricted access to services are not isolated incidences. They build on the immigration system itself. When no raid is occurring, even when no raids are occurring, families are forced to live with constant calculation. Is it safe to go to work? Is it safe to take the kids to school? Is it safe to go to the grocery store or to go to a clinic? Everyday decisions become survival decisions. And then there's the cultural violence. The narratives that we're hearing so much that justify these harms, anti-immigrant rhetoric circulating through political speech, media, social networks, that frames immigrants as threats, criminals, or invaders. Those are narratives that create permission for harsh enforcement or that attempt to create permission for harsh enforcement and deepen fear and exclusion. As a faculty member of Loyola University School of Social Work, I see its impact on these forms of violence in every day through our students, through their families, and through the communities they serve. At any given time, we have approximately 400 students in professional practicum placements across the city and the metropolitan area. Students do their internships in hospitals, schools, shelters, mental health centers, libraries, and community-based organizations throughout the city. Some are placed in refugee resettlement service agencies, while others are in settings where immigrant families are part of the everyday service population, but aren't the target population for the organization. Students bring to the classroom what they're seeing in the field. They talk about how systemic violence reaches into the everyday life of the clients that they see, and into their own, for many of them, their personal lives as well. Several students have shared that relatives in mixed status households have chosen to return to Mexico out of fear, including taking their U.S. citizen high school seniors to Mexico with them because they no longer feel safe remaining here. Others described clients in schools and community programs whose parents or family members were suddenly detained, creating crisis around caregiving, school attendance, emotional stability, and legal planning. Students were asking, how do we help parents talk to children without increasing fear? How do we support families in making emergency plans and temporary guardianship planning? How do we respond when agencies are unprepared to address these realities? So we began to incorporate more of this information into the classes, provide information regarding resources to share with their internship agencies and clients. And we provided space in the classroom for reflection, information sharing, and support. Students interning in immigrant serving organizations saw clients stop attending services altogether because families feared being targeted simply by entering into their spaces. We also saw the loss of many of our field placement sites in refugee resettlement agencies because many had lost the funding. And that reduced the training opportunities for future social workers, but more importantly, it reduced the services and supports for the refugees that they had previously served. At this moment, it was clear to the social work school that we must move beyond responding to harm and become more actively engaged in violence prevention. One important example of our work is through the Holistic Immigration Hub, where students are participating in interdisciplinary efforts that strengthen protection before the harm of the structural violence of our immigration system becomes irreversible. A key initiative for the School of Social Work has been the Forensic Mental Health Assessment Clinic pilot, developed in partnership with the Loyola School of Law that my colleague Sarah talked a little bit about earlier. I didn't move to the slide forward. Okay, here you've got some photographs from a group of students that we have in the school. Well, there were students from the School of Social Work, from criminal justice, and also from international relations that worked in collaboration with alumni from the School of Law, Moises Hernandez, and then also an alumnus from the School of Social Work, who's a licensed clinical social worker, Mauricio Cifuentes. With their support, the students developed case scenarios, did role plays, and we developed a curriculum, a 4-module curriculum that prepares social workers or mental health professionals and the medical school was also involved as well, to work in interdisciplinary contexts to provide forensic mental health evaluations to support immigration legal proceedings. In this model, and through the Holistic Immigration Hub, we've been able to pilot that curriculum, and then now are building on it more through the clinic. In this model, as Sarah mentioned, law students and social work students trained together to prepare forensic mental health evaluations for immigration cases. These evaluations document trauma, persecution, abuse, psychological harm in ways that can directly support protections under asylum, VAWA, U visas, T visas, and other forms of immigration relief. These evaluations matter because they document harm, providing evidence recognized by legal systems. The research shows that asylum applicants who receive forensic mental health assessments and medical evaluations are granted protection at dramatically higher rates than those that do not. Yet there are a very small percentage of applicants access forensic evaluations due to barriers that include a lack of clinicians that are trained to perform these assessments and to work in these interprofessional contexts that are required, and the cost. Fees for such assessments are $1,000 and above. The Holistic Immigration Hub addresses both of these barriers by training professionals to do this work in interprofessional teams as students perform the assessments under the guidance of law faculty and licensed mental health clinicians. And by engaging in this kind of work, in addition to offering critical emotional support after the experience of violence, we're preparing social workers and attorneys to actively intervene and prevent further harm by helping secure legal protections. So now we're also in the process of building the capacity out further. So they're not only training our current students so that they can do this work in the future, but also developing through our continuing education program and welcoming back alumnus from our program who are already licensed clinical social workers to receive this training on how they conduct forensic mental health evaluation, and creating a wider network of folks who can continue to do that on a pro bono basis. Thank you.
I'm going to veer a little bit. I'm Ruth Gomberg. I'm a professor of anthropology. Am I too loud? Oh, okay. I'm a professor of anthropology, and as an anthropologist, I work with people who are members of mixed status families and communities. So people who have, different citizenship statuses, and I do that in Chicago, and I do that in Mexico City. So that's one sort of community that's been separated. And my work as an anthropologist it's community grounded. So as much as I can, I try to take the direction of community organizations that I work with, many of which, are led by people who are directly affected. And so I wanted to actually I'm not part of the Holistic Immigration Hub. I don't know how I smuggled myself on this panel. These are some of my favorite women, though, so I'm glad that I was able to come. But I did want to spend my time just sort of like paying forward some of the lessons that I learned from my community organizing partners, in particular in the fall. So we've been talking about violence. The violence that I want to focus on here is the violence that was enacted on our city and other cities by ICE acting as sort of a paramilitary organization and really coming to the streets and generating street violence all over, not just in the communities that are normally targeted in this way, but in other places too, in suburbs, et cetera. And when that happened, there was, and sorry, in case there's any sort of question about what the intention of that was, the day before Trump wrote, Chicago is about to find out why it's called the Department of War. So this was a very intentional violent attack on our city. And so I really want to focus on number 5, the community response. And I want to do that because one of the lessons that I've learned in the 20 or so years that I've been working with community organizations is that, good organizing involves caring for each other, caring for the community, showing up. And one of the favorite lines that I like from organizing spaces is, we keep each other safe. And so when in the fall, as ICE was here, there was this groundswell of really hyper-local, very quick forming responses, organizing responses. And so I wanted to spend my time today sharing that with all of you, for you to share with your networks as well. So as community members organized really rapidly, we found that there were a lot of meaningful ways that we could work to keep each other safe in this context. One is by observing, being out there, checking license plates, being present in the places where this violence was taking place, recording information, being out in the street, walking in the park, wearing your whistle, just all of these very hyper-local things that you can do as part of a community network. In addition, on the more sort of organized level, working on sanctuary policies, working with community organizations like Chicago Cred that we heard about earlier to make sure that we're building a robust, highly networked community response. And then, of course, some of the larger events like the No Kings Parade and stuff like that. So I did just want to share some quick tips. The first is that it's really important not to make things worse. Fear is part of the violence, and it's wielded against us. So it's really important that if you are safe to do so, that you verify rumors before you repeat them, especially on social media. It's really easy to repost things. Don't verify it before you repeat. Get trained up. It's good to know your rights. It's good to know what rights are. And the people who are really leading these Know Your Rights trainings right now are the experts. They're the ones who've been leading this movement for a long time. They're the ones who day in and day out are working with people who are in situations of detention and deportation. And they're really good at communicating exactly what's happening today on the ground effectively. You can find Know Your Rights trainings. They're basically available on the internet now, but ICER, Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, runs a really good one. Something that's really easy that everybody can do is save a hotline number on your phone, 2 or 3, and just give them to people. It doesn't hurt to have a hotline number on your phone. Getting legal attention really quickly is so key to, 1, helping families locate their loved ones, and 2, in some cases, delaying a deportation so that a person can get legal help. So that's a really easy thing. Just download some hotline numbers to your phone, share them with everybody. Get your whistles, friends. I assume that everybody knows what I'm talking about here, but we have found that, at least for now, wearing whistles and blowing them is an effective way to draw a crowd, and it can shape enforcement actions. It can deter them. Number 4, and I think, the earlier panel, I'm just sort of thinking with it, and it's been sticking with me, but this whole idea of showing up, being there for each other in person, being in the spaces where people are, working together, showing love, right? And maybe this is the wrong generation as I'm looking at the audience, but kids, you can put down your phones and be in a community with each other. Social media stuff is fine. It's good for some things. It's not so good for that interpersonal keeping each other safe. And that leads me to my final point, which is leaning into community, right? Now is the time to show up for each other, to, really lean into that extra love, that extra nurturing, that extra community goodness, because, it's so easy right now, I think, to feel demoralized and discouraged. And this is where I find my optimism. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. These panelists have been really lovely to work with, and I've really enjoyed getting to hear from each of their respective fields and getting this other perspective of what community violence can look like and what steps they are taking. And that actually leads me to ask a question as well. As the audience members think about how to engage with the issues raised today, what is one meaningful step they can take to get involved? And what gives you hope
and keeps you committed to this work despite the challenges communities are facing? I'd love to hear a response from each of you.
Thank you. So I'm going to answer the what gives me hope, and that is our students. Our students have repeatedly, again, much of the design is based on their call for more robust and meaningful action, especially in the space of law, which has become, well, it's being ignored, I think, as we all see. So, you know, in this space for a very long time, we've seen DHS and particularly CBP behave lawlessly. They behave lawlessly on the border. They've done it quietly and in the darkness. And now they're doing it in communities and in spaces where everyone can see. And so people are starting to get on board for the idea that perhaps the way in which the structural and legalized violence that comes through their operations is not okay. And so our students have long been calling to abolish ICE. And those were met, those calls were really met with sort of an eye roll. And we are now at a place and a space and time where I think enough people have joined in solidarity to the point where I feel like abolish ICE feels to me almost like a foregone conclusion. And so to me, that brings me hope. And spaces like these where people come together, where we listen to one another, hear what's happening in each other's spaces, it's actually creating dialogue and creating spaces where we're moving the dial on things that we once thought were immovable objects. That gives me hope.
I think what inspires me and gives me hope is not just saying this for the university's sake, but our interdisciplinary moments. You know, as an educator, I'm also inspired by students, but helping students see, and Sarah said it earlier, or has said it before, you know, particularly in medicine, how to practice in a system that you imagine, not the current one because it is completely broken, but to remain hopeful that you are training in a way with inspiring people that are going to build it the way that it should be. And as a physician, I can't build that with just physicians. We have to build this health and this view of health, which is, you know, for these complex problems like violence, it really has to be addressed outside of healthcare facilities. And so doing this together with people in education and people in anthropology and people from all different perspectives that can bring their expertise. It's sort of just like getting out of your own neighborhood, right? Too, you're going to learn and be able to see and flip these problems around and see in a different way when you can leave your own perspective. So I guess working with a diverse group, living in a diverse city gives me hope we're going to solve these complex problems.
So I'll answer both in terms of next steps. So a couple of things that I think about is, as Dr. Gomberg mentioned, don't just show up, be in those spaces. I would also say I think it's important to emphasize the need to take risk. And my own issue, I take risk without thinking, but it's always paid off for me. As an educator in the spaces that I've worked in, I've had the opportunity to push for equity and a lot of the work both in Milwaukee Public Schools and here at Loyola. And even though sometimes I take risks without thinking, it's always paid off. And so if anybody in here, the next opportunity that you have and you're worried about the risk, just do it. Because especially if you have the privilege, you'll be fine, I promise you. But what gives me hope is my students. And I think that, and my own children, because I think that there's something that youth remind me as a professor, even though I'm an associate dean, I still teach, and I teach special education law, where we also learn about the injustices within the way that we serve students with unique learning needs. And my students and the questions that they ask, the drive that they come to make the next phase of education, whatever that looks like, a better place for all children, gives me hope. And what I always tell my students is, in order to dismantle a system and make it better, you have to learn how it works. And so as we learn how these things are currently structured, they're also questioning and they're also thinking about, and kind of what you were saying, Dr. Blair, how do I operate in the system I want to see? How do I dream? How do I continue to think about my training and bring the skills that I have with that. And so I say take the risks. And I also think about continue if you're a student in this audience, continue to ask the hard questions, because your professors, they may not always show it. They're learning from you. And I think that that's part of your learning as well, is questioning those current systems.
Thank you. I think I'm going to also talk a little bit about what inspires me and gives me hope. I would echo everything that my colleagues have said, so my comments will be brief. But I think for me, what gives me the most hope is the extraordinary amount of solidarity and creativity I've seen in the community responses that Ruth talked about, everything from like the rapid response networks to walking school buses for kids to get to school safely. So the mutual aid that we're seeing, and not only in this moment that's so difficult, but Amy, you talked about when all the newcomers were arriving, how people showed up for them when we didn't have all of the infrastructure in place to care for everybody. And so for me, that really gives me a lot of hope and inspiration. And then beyond Loyola University, I didn't mention, we work a lot with Jesuit Migrant Services across the Americas and in the Caribbean, as well as Jesuit Refugee Services. And so I'm also inspired by the work that they do, because they do migrant accompaniment from communities of origin, transit, destination, and now return if there's deportation involved. And so being part of a larger network that's working on these issues for me is really inspiring and hopeful.
Yeah, me too. And most directly, just with working with young people, I guess I'm that age, everybody looks young to me now, but who have these these personal experiences and who have become leaders themselves, right, in these movements. Just, that's what gives me hope. Yeah. It's not hope, it's confidence. Hope is when you, don't know that it's going to turn out all right. Confidence, I think.
All right. Thank you guys so much for that answer. Let's go ahead and give them a big round of applause.